In his hand, Dwight Eisenhower holds a piece of paper. The handwriting is shaky, rushed, the words of a man writing under tremendous pressure. It begins with 5 words that would have changed history. Our landings have failed. This is the letter Eisenhower prayed the world would never read, written on the night before D-Day, when the fate of civilization rested on one man's decision. But the order he gave that morning, the choice that saved the free world, would haunt him every single day for the rest of his life. What you're about to hear has been buried in the shadows of victory for decades. This is what really happened on June 6, 1944, and why the Supreme Commander never forgave himself for the price of triumph. June 4, 1944, Southwick House, Portsmouth, England. Rain hammers against the windows of a manor house that has become the nerve center for the largest military operation in human history. Inside a wood-paneled room, 9 men sit around a table covered with maps, weather charts and intelligence reports. The air is thick with cigarette smoke and tension so palpable you could cut it with a knife. These are the men who will decide whether Operation Overlord, the invasion of Nazi-occupied France, will proceed as planned or be postponed, possibly for weeks or even months. At the head of the table sits Dwight David Eisenhower, Supreme Allied Commander, a farm boy from Kansas, who now holds the fate of millions in his hands. Eisenhower never wanted this responsibility. Born in 1890 in Denison, Texas, and raised in Abilene, Kansas, young Dwight grew up in modest circumstances. His family valued hard work and education, but had little money. He attended West Point, not out of burning military ambition, but because it offered a free education. At the academy, he was a good student, not brilliant, more interested in football than tactics. After graduation, he spent decades in the peacetime army, a career of slow promotions and desk assignments. While contemporaries like Patton cultivated reputations as warriors, Eisenhower became known as a skilled administrator and planner. He had never commanded troops in combat, never heard shots fired in anger, never made a battlefield decision that cost men their lives. Then came World War II, and everything changed. Army Chief of Staff George Marshall recognized in Eisenhower a rare gift, the ability to coordinate complex operations and manage difficult personalities. When America needed a supreme commander for Operation Overlord, Marshall chose Eisenhower over more experienced combat generals. The decision shocked many, including Eisenhower himself. Now in June 1944, this man who had never led soldiers in battle was about to order the largest amphibious assault in history, an operation that would either liberate Europe or end in catastrophic failure. Meteorologist Group Captain James Stagg stands before the assembled commanders, his face grave, a Scottish academic with no military background beyond his current posting. Stagg has the unenviable task of predicting weather patterns over the English Channel, where conditions can change with terrifying speed. For weeks he has been monitoring a high-pressure system that promised good weather for the planned invasion date of June 5th. But now, just 24 hours before H-hour, that system has collapsed. A major storm is battering the channel, with winds that would swamp landing craft and clouds that would ground the thousands of aircraft essential to the invasion's success. Stagg delivers his verdict in clipped, precise tones. The storm will continue through June 5th and possibly June 6th. He cannot recommend launching the invasion under these conditions. The room erupts in discussion. Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, responsible for air operations, immediately argues for postponement. He warns that attempting to fly in these conditions would be suicide for air crews and useless for ground troops who desperately need air support. Admiral Bertram Ramsay, commanding naval forces, points out that his ships are already at sea, that recalling them and maintaining secrecy would be nearly impossible. General Bernard Montgomery, who will command all ground forces during the initial assault, sits silently, his sharp eyes moving from speaker to speaker. Eisenhower listens to each argument, his face revealing nothing. He has already postponed the invasion once, moving it from June 5th to June 6th based on tidal and moonlight requirements. The next window of acceptable conditions won't come for 2 weeks, and even that isn't certain. 2 weeks of keeping hundreds of thousands of troops ready, of maintaining the secrecy that has been so carefully constructed, of hoping the Germans don't discover the invasion plans. 2 weeks during which anything could go wrong. But launching into a storm carries its own terrible risks. Landing craft could capsize in heavy seas. Paratroopers could be scattered across Normandy by high winds, landing miles from their objectives. Aircraft could crash or miss their targets entirely. The invasion could fail before the first soldier reached the beach. At 9:15 p.m., Eisenhower adjourns the meeting. He tells his commanders to rest, that they will reconvene at 4:30 the next morning for a final decision. As the room empties, Eisenhower remains seated, staring at the map spread before him. His aide, Commander Harry Butcher, later wrote that the Supreme Commander sat motionless for nearly an hour, occasional lighting a cigarette, only to let it burn down to his fingers, lost in thought. The weight of command has never been heavier. Whatever decision he makes in the morning, men will die because of it. The only question is how many, and whether their deaths will serve a purpose or be wasted in failure. Sometime after 11 p.m., Eisenhower walks to a small office adjoining the conference room. He sits at a simple wooden desk, pulls out a piece of paper, and begins to write. His hand trembles slightly, whether from fatigue, stress, or the weight of what he's writing. No one will ever know. The letter is brief, just 3 sentences, but every word carries the burden of potential catastrophe. He writes, "Our landings in the Cherbourg-Havre area have failed to gain a satisfactory foothold, and I have withdrawn the troops. My decision to attack at this time and place was based upon the best information available. The troops, the air and the navy did all that bravery and devotion to duty could do. If any blame or fault attaches to the attempt, it is mine alone." In his exhaustion and stress, Eisenhower makes a small mistake. He dates the letter July 5th instead of June 5th. It's the kind of error anyone might make after weeks of 18-hour days and sleepless nights, but it reveals something about his mental state. His mind is already jumping forward, imagining the aftermath of failure, the investigations and recriminations that would follow. The letter is an attempt to protect the thousands of men who will carry out his orders. If the invasion fails, Eisenhower wants the world to know that the fault lies with him, and him alone, not with the soldiers, sailors and airmen who will follow his commands into hell. He folds the letter and puts it in his pocket. Years later, his naval aide found it there, creased and worn, a reminder of the burden Eisenhower carried. But on this night, the letter serves another purpose. Writing it forces Eisenhower to confront the possibility of failure directly, to imagine the worst outcome and accept responsibility for it. In a strange way, this acceptance liberates him. If he's already prepared to take the blame for failure, then the decision becomes clearer. The question isn't whether the invasion might fail, it's whether postponement offers any better chance of success. And Eisenhower knows it doesn't. Every day of delay increases the risk of discovery, weakens morale, and gives the Germans more time to strengthen their defenses. June 5th, 1944, before dawn. The same commanders gather again in the same room, but everything feels different. The rain has intensified, drumming against the windows like artillery fire. Wind rattles the shutters. It's hard to imagine worse conditions for an invasion. Stagg returns to deliver his updated forecast, and this time there's a glimmer of hope in his report. His analysis suggests a brief break in the weather, starting late on June 5th and continuing through June 6th. The window will be narrow, perhaps 36 hours, but it will be there. After June 6th, more storms are coming, and the next clear window might not arrive for weeks. The debate begins again, but this time with greater urgency. Montgomery speaks first, and his words surprise some in the room. He argues for proceeding with the invasion. The Germans won't expect an attack in marginal weather, he reasons, and surprise could compensate for difficult conditions. Leigh Mallory remains skeptical, warning again about air operations, but his opposition has softened. Ramsey points out that his naval forces are perfectly capable of operating in these conditions, that British and American sailors have handled worse. One by one, the commanders offer their opinions, but everyone understands that the decision belongs to Eisenhower alone. At precisely 4:15 a.m., Eisenhower stands. The room falls silent. Every eye is on the Supreme Commander, waiting for words that will shape history. Eisenhower looks around the table, meeting each man's gaze, and then he speaks 5 words that will echo through time. "Okay, we'll go." That's it. No grand speech, no dramatic flourish, just a simple declaration of intent. But in those 5 words, Eisenhower has committed hundreds of thousands of men to battle. accepted the possibility of catastrophic failure, and placed a bet on which the future of human freedom depends. The meeting adjourns. Commanders rush to their posts to set in motion the machinery of invasion, and Eisenhower is left alone with his decision. June 6, 1944 begins before dawn. Eisenhower hasn't slept. He spent the night visiting with paratroopers of the 101st Airborne Division, men who will be among the first to land in France, dropped behind enemy lines in darkness to secure key objectives. He walks among them as they prepare to board aircraft, stopping to chat, asking where they're from, wishing them luck. The paratroopers, most barely 20 years old, respond with a mixture of bravado and nervousness. They know many of them won't survive the night. Eisenhower knows it too. One soldier later recalled the Supreme Commander's face in the dim light, how his smile seemed forced, how his eyes looked infinitely sad. As the transport aircraft roar into the night sky, Eisenhower watches until the last plane disappears. His aide notes that the Supreme Commander's shoulders seem to sag, as if the weight of what he's set in motion is physically crushing him. He returns to headquarters and waits. There's nothing else he can do now. The invasion is beyond his control, in the hands of thousands of young men facing German guns on beaches with code names Utah, Omaha, Gold, Juno, Sword. All Eisenhower can do is wait for reports and pray that his decision was right. The first reports begin arriving around 7 a.m. Utah Beach, landing successful, casualties light, objectives being secured. Gold and Juno, British and Canadian forces encountering resistance but making progress. Sword, similar story, tough fighting but the beachhead is expanding. For a brief moment, relief washes over Eisenhower. The invasion is working. His decision was correct. Then comes the report from Omaha Beach, and everything changes. Omaha Beach is a killing ground. The initial waves of American troops have been decimated. German defenders, positioned on high bluffs overlooking the beach, pour withering fire onto exposed soldiers. The carefully planned bombardment that was supposed to destroy German positions largely missed its targets. Soldiers wade ashore into a maelstrom of machine gun fire, artillery shells and mortar rounds. The water turns red. Bodies pile up at the waterline. Men cower behind beach obstacles, pinned down, unable to advance or retreat. By mid-morning, nearly 2,400 Americans are dead or wounded on a beach less than 4 miles long. General Omar Bradley, commanding American ground forces, receives the catastrophic reports aboard the USS Augusta offshore. He contemplates the unthinkable, evacuating Omaha Beach, abandoning the position, and trying to reinforce the other beaches. It would mean admitting failure, acknowledging that the invasion plan had a fatal flaw. Bradley sends an urgent message to Eisenhower. Omaha is in crisis. The situation is desperate. What are his orders? Eisenhower reads the message, and for one terrible moment, the letter in his pocket feels like prophecy. The landings are failing. His decision to proceed may have been catastrophically wrong. Around him, staff officers wait for orders, their faces reflecting the same fear Eisenhower feels in his gut. The Supreme Commander stands at the crossroads of history. He can order evacuation, admit failure, and face the consequences. Or he can trust that American soldiers on Omaha Beach will find a way to survive and advance. The decision takes seconds, but it feels like hours. Eisenhower's response is unequivocal. No evacuation. Reinforce Omaha. Every available ship, every reserve unit, everything goes to Omaha. The men on that beach will not be abandoned. By early afternoon, the situation on Omaha begins to change. Small groups of soldiers, led by sergeants and lieutenants, whose names history would never record, start moving up the bluffs. They find gaps in German defenses, exploit weaknesses, and slowly, painfully, begin to push inland. Navy destroyers, risking running aground, move close to shore and blast German positions with point-blank fire. More troops land, reinforcing the desperate men clinging to the beach. By nightfall, Omaha Beach is secure. The cost is staggering, more than 2,000 casualties in a single day. But the beachhead holds. Eisenhower receives the final reports near midnight. All 5 beaches are secure. The invasion has succeeded. Allied forces are ashore in France, and despite terrible losses, the liberation of Europe has begun. Staff officers celebrate, opening bottles of champagne, congratulating each other on a historic victory. But Eisenhower doesn't join the celebration. He sits alone in his office, the letter still in his pocket, thinking about the cost. 2,000 dead at Omaha, hundreds more on other beaches, thousands of paratroopers scattered across Normandy, many cut off behind enemy lines, fighting desperately to survive, all because of his decision to proceed despite the weather, despite the risks, despite the possibility of failure. A week later, Eisenhower visits Normandy for the first time. He tours the beaches, now cluttered with the debris of invasion, wrecked landing craft, abandoned equipment, and countless graves marked with temporary crosses and stars of David. At Omaha, he walks the sand where so many Americans died. A young lieutenant, one of the survivors of the first wave, approaches and salutes. The lieutenant, not knowing he's speaking to the Supreme Commander, asks a question that will haunt Eisenhower for the rest of his life. "Sir, who gave the order to attack on this day?" Eisenhower looks at the young officer, at the exhaustion and grief in his eyes, and answers quietly, "I did, son, and I see them in my dreams every night." The invasion of Normandy succeeded beyond even optimistic projections. Within weeks, Allied forces broke out from the beachhead and began the liberation of France. By May 1945, Nazi Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over, won at tremendous cost, but won nonetheless. Eisenhower emerged from the war as one of history's greatest commanders, celebrated in America and Britain, honored with parades and medals, and the gratitude of millions. He became President of the United States, serving 2 terms in the 1950s. He lived until March 1969, dying at age 78, revered as a statesman and hero. But those who knew him best understood that Eisenhower never truly left Normandy. His son John later wrote that his father would sometimes wake in the night, speaking names of soldiers he'd met on June 5, 1944, paratroopers who jumped into darkness and never came home. In private moments, Eisenhower would take out the letter he'd written the night before D-Day, now yellowed with age, and read it again. Friends asked why he kept it, why he tortured himself with this reminder of what might have been. Eisenhower never gave a satisfactory answer, but those closest to him understood. The letter was penance for the power he'd wielded, a reminder that every great decision carries a price paid in human lives. In 1960, President-elect John F. Kennedy visited Eisenhower at the White House for the traditional transition meeting. Kennedy, young and confident, asked the outgoing president what advice he would give about leadership and command. Eisenhower was silent for a long moment, and when he spoke, his voice was heavy with memory. "Never put yourself in a position where you have to make a choice like I made on June 5, 1944. And if you do find yourself there, never forget that you're not choosing between right and wrong. You're choosing which price you're willing to pay, and other people will pay it for you." Kennedy, who would face his own moments of terrible choice during the Cuban Missile Crisis, never forgot those words. Years later, after Kennedy's assassination, Eisenhower attended the funeral. Standing at Arlington National Cemetery, looking at row upon row of white headstones, he was heard to murmur, "They're all my boys, every single one of them." No one knew if he was referring to Kennedy, to the soldiers who died under his command in World War II, or to all the young men who had died in service to their country. Perhaps he meant all of them. In his final years, Eisenhower's health declined. Heart disease, the same condition that had plagued him since the war years, caught up with him. In the hospital, during what would be his final illness, his grandson David visited. David, who would later marry Richard Nixon's daughter, asked his grandfather what he was most proud of in his life. Eisenhower, weak but still lucid, thought for a long time before answering. David expected him to mention D-Day, or the defeat of Nazi Germany, or his presidency. Instead, Eisenhower said simply, "I kept my word to the men who served under me. I never asked them to do something I wasn't willing to take responsibility for." Then David asked a harder question, "What's your biggest regret?" Again, Eisenhower was silent, staring at something beyond the hospital room walls, beyond the present moment, back to a rainy night in England 25 years earlier. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely a whisper. "I can't forget the beaches, David. I can't forget what it cost." Every single life lost was because I said go. I know it was necessary. I know we had to do it. But I can't forget, and I don't think I should forget. The day I forget the price, I'll have betrayed every man who paid it. 3 days later, on March 28, 1969, Dwight David Eisenhower died. Among his personal effects, his family found the letter, still in an envelope, still dated July 5th instead of June 5th. Decades had passed since D-Day, but Eisenhower had carried that letter with him as a reminder of the burden of command. Today, the letter is displayed at the Eisenhower Presidential Library in Abilene, Kansas. Visitors often pause before it, reading the shaky handwriting, imagining the man who wrote it, knowing that morning would bring either the greatest triumph or the most catastrophic failure in military history. The letter was never sent. The invasion succeeded. The world was saved from Nazi tyranny. But for Eisenhower, the victory was inseparable from its cost. He understood something that history often forgets. Great triumphs require great sacrifices, and someone has to order men to make those sacrifices. The burden of that responsibility never leaves the person who bears it. Every general who has ever sent soldiers into battle carries that weight, but few have borne it as heavily as Eisenhower, who sent hundreds of thousands of men onto the beaches of Normandy and lived with the consequences for the rest of his life. On June 6th each year, the anniversary of D-Day, ceremonies are held at the American Cemetery overlooking Omaha Beach. 9,387 white marble crosses and Stars of David mark the graves of Americans who died liberating France. Speakers praise their sacrifice, honor their courage, and celebrate the victory they made possible. But standing among those graves, it's impossible not to think of Eisenhower, of the letter in his pocket, of the burden he carried. These men died following his orders, based on his decision to proceed despite the weather, despite the risks, despite the very real possibility of catastrophic failure. They trusted him with their lives, and he spent the rest of his life trying to prove worthy of that trust. Military historians still debate Eisenhower's decision. Some argue he had no choice, that postponement would have been worse than proceeding in marginal weather. Others suggest the invasion could have been delayed, that the risks of attacking in a storm were too great. The debate misses the larger point. Eisenhower made the best decision he could with the information available, accepted full responsibility for the consequences, and lived with the weight of that decision for the rest of his life. That is the essence of leadership in its purest, most painful form. In the decades since D-Day, American forces have launched countless operations from Korea to Vietnam to Iraq and Afghanistan. Commanders have made difficult decisions, ordering men and women into danger, accepting that some will not return. Each of these commanders, in their own way, has written their own version of Eisenhower's letter, taking responsibility for decisions that cost lives. The best of them, like Eisenhower, never forget the human cost of their commands. They understand that leadership isn't about glory or victory parades. It's about making impossible choices and living with the consequences. Today, when we celebrate D-Day, we remember the soldiers who stormed the beaches, the paratroopers who jumped into darkness, the sailors who brought them to France's shores. We should also remember the man who sent them there, who made the hardest decision of his life, knowing that whatever he chose, men would die. Eisenhower didn't seek that responsibility. He didn't want the burden of command over Operation Overlord. But when duty called, he accepted it, made his decision, and carried the weight of it until his dying day. The letter he wrote the night before D-Day, the letter he prayed would never be read, stands as a testament to the terrible price of leadership and the courage it takes to accept responsibility for decisions that shape history. He saved the world, but Eisenhower never forgave himself for the price, and perhaps that is as it should be. Perhaps the men who order others to die should carry that burden always, should never find peace, should never forget the cost of the choices they make. It keeps them human, it keeps them humble. It reminds them that behind every strategic decision, every operational plan, every military objective, there are individual human beings with families and dreams and futures that may end because of an order given by someone they'll never meet. Eisenhower understood this better than most, and it made him both a great commander and a tormented man. That is his legacy, and it is one worth remembering.